Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. A very good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're signing in from. Today's session on the SBTi target setting tool is the second portion of a two-part webinar series that aims to provide an introduction to the SBTi criteria and target setting steps for companies looking to join the SBTi in order to get your targets validated according to climate science. So before we begin, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping items. Firstly, this webinar, as well as our previous introduction session last week, are recorded. The recordings and slides will be shared with all participants and made available on the SBTi YouTube channel. And throughout this session, if you have any specific questions, please feel free to put them into the Zoom Q&A box, and we will try our best to address them in the next hour. So today's agenda is as follows. We'll run through some technical aspects behind target setting based on the SBTi criteria, then provide an overview of the available tools, followed by a live demonstration of how to use the SBTi target setting tool itself. And finally, some time to answer some of your questions on this webinar before wrapping up for today. And with me today, I have two of my colleagues from the SBTi, McKenna Smith, who is our Target Validation Manager, as well as Zaniko Schlapo, who is our Engagement Manager from South Africa. And without further ado, I will hand it over to McKenna.
Great, thanks so much, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be speaking with you here today, and I'm excited to hear some of your guys' questions about the technical aspects later on in the webinar. So as stated, my name is McKenna, and I'm the Target Validation Manager. I'm currently based at WWF in Paris, and so as I go along today, there might be some things that need clarification. So if you do pop any questions that can be easily answered into the Q&A chat box, my colleagues will answer those throughout the webinar, and we can handle some of the more in-depth and technical questions later on the webinar itself. Right, so ever since the IPCC released the report Warming on 1.5C, the Science Based Targets Initiative has done away with companies setting only 2C targets and has a minimum requirement of well below 2C and 1.5C for scope 1 and 2 targets. Our Foundations of Science-Based Target Setting paper explains how the Science-Based Targets Initiative has used newly available science to align its methods with the 1.5C pathway. And as more science comes out, the documents are updated accordingly. And this is something that we also encourage companies to do, is to make sure your targets are still in line with science as per all of the documents that come out, as well as the guidance that we produce. So this document reflects a very in-depth conversation between the scientific advisory group, which is composed of lead scientists who work on the IPCC, as well as the International Energy Agency and other academic institutions as well, in order for us to set a science-based target method for everyone to use. And we'll go into a bit more detail later on in the webinar about what that actually means when you're choosing a method to set a science-based target with. Right, so just for a bit of background so everyone is on the same page, we have kind of three key pieces here when we're talking about science-based targets. So the first is a carbon budget. A greenhouse gas budget is an estimate of the cumulative CO2, methane, other Kyoto gases that can be emitted over a period of time, while also limiting temperature rise to a specific amount. So carbon budgets, as we know them well, are the basis for the construction of our science-based target methods, as it's relatively an easy concept for companies to grasp and also translate to the company metrics. This would be tons of CO2e emitted per year, for example. However, carbon budget calculations, they're not very easy, as they're very sensitive to the assumptions regarding climate sensitivity and the likelihood of the temperature outcomes. So the next piece here is emission scenarios. Emission scenarios provide us with the insight into how emissions reductions could be achieved under a variety of socioeconomic and political conditions while staying within that first carbon budget, right? A scenario describes a hypothetical future and the path kind of leading to that future. And scenarios are sometimes misinterpreted as being predictions or forecasts. In fact, the concept of scenarios is explicitly based on the premise that the future cannot be predicted. So therefore, when we talk about the approach of a scenario analysis, it helps to evaluate a variety of alternative futures, both desirable and also undesirable. The last piece here is an allocation approach. And an allocation approach refers to the way that the carbon budget underlying a given emission scenario is allocated among companies with the same level of disaggregation, such as globally or within a region or a sector. And we'll talk about the methodologies that the SBTi use and have actually developed to allocate this budget to companies. Or in other words, like the budget to set a greenhouse gas target, right? So in a nutshell, the carbon budget is how much we can emit. The emission scenario tells us how much that budget could be spent over time. And the science-based target methods help companies determine how much they need to reduce their emissions and how quickly they need to do that in order to be in line with that emission scenario. So this is an excellent visual representation of what I was just explaining. So as you can see on the left, we have a certain level of concentration of atmospheric CO2. Next, we look at our carbon budget. So the purple there is representing the historic cumulative emissions, and the white at the very top is our remaining carbon budget. And so going back to the previous slide, the carbon budget there allows us to understand how much those scenarios need to be in line with the science to limit warming, for example. So if we look at the very far right, the emission scenario for different temperature goals, you can see there the gray line on the left is the historic emissions, and we have a representative of 1.5C pathway and a representative of a well below 2C pathway. So the area under that curve is the remaining emissions that we can emit in order to stay within that carbon budget. So the purple is obviously represented the purple on both the bucket and the graph. But the key piece here is we're really looking to understand which pathways we can take for companies in order to use that remaining carbon budget and not go over. And so this is why the SBTi recently has announced that as of July 2022, we will no longer be accepting well below 2C pathways for scope 1 and 2 companies. So we will be only accepting 1.5C from July 2022 forward. And why do we make these kinds of statements? It's because of the impacts that we know that choosing different temperature pathways will have on the Earth in the long run, right? So if we chose a 1.5C pathway, we are still going to have impacts, right? But those impacts will not be as severe as if companies have chosen 2-degree pathways or well below 2-degree pathways. So for example, the global population exposed to severe heat at least once every 5 years is 2.6 times worse with 2C impacts. And there's only a much lower and less considerable impact for a 1.5C pathway. Again, the number of ice-free Arctic summers is a 10-time worse scenario with a 2C pathway. But again, we're still getting impacts with a 1.5C pathway of at least 1 every 100 years. There's further decline in our coral reefs. Again, with the 2C impact here, we're looking up to 29% worse. But however, with 1.5C, we are still expecting there's the potential of 70 to 90% there. Finally, the decline in marine fisheries, it's 2 times worse for companies aligning with a 2C pathway rather than a 1.5C pathway. So despite understanding kind of the severity of these climate change impacts, the current policies, and this is especially poignant after the COP26 that we were just watching, the current policies put us on track for 2.7 to 3.1C warming, and the pledges at COP26 before they all went in to do the different negotiations only put us at 2.4C warming. So you can understand why it's more important than ever for companies to set 1.5C targets in order to further drive this ambitious reduction of emissions. Right, so this is a really good example of how all of those different emission scenarios are kind of screened out. So as you can see on the left, we have a lot of different probabilities in many different scenarios for what kind of warming we could end up with. So in the middle there, those are the lower than 2C pathways. And as you can see on the very far right there, this is a demonstration of how we showcase to companies how their interim targets, or their near-term targets that we're all working to set now, can really help get rid of that initial curve in order to move our way down to the 1.5C under 2C warming there. So you can see there the 5 to 15-year target. That's actually changed now from July, and we will be looking for 5 to 10 in order to kind of accelerate this faster reductions. And that will put us in line, hopefully, with making sure that we can incentivize companies to stay within that 1.5C warming. So the global greenhouse gas emission scenarios drawn from the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium are used to construct that envelope for 1.5C and the well below 2C compliance. And then there's a certain scientific way that our technical team goes about making sure that we are responsible and objective and consistent with the ways that we are setting the 1.5C pathways, both for a universal pathway, but also sector-specific pathways, which we will come on to a little bit later. So in general, the linear reduction rate was calculated from 2020 to 2035 to keep within that 5 to 15-year window there. Right, so here's a really good demonstration at a very high level of the different methods that are available for setting scope 1, 2, and 3 targets. We'll come on to this a bit in more specific detail later. But for scope 1 and 2, you have 2 options: absolute contraction and physical intensity reduction. For scope 3, there are slightly more options. You have economic intensity reduction and supplier engagement targets. But the absolute contraction for scope 1 and 2 and the physical intensity reduction for scope 1 and 2 are the 2 options, and we're going to be describing those in a bit more detail so you understand maybe the applicability for your company or your sector. Right, so now we'll go into a bit more detail about the methods, which I think will be very relevant for everybody. So as explained previously, the methods fit into 2 categories: contraction and convergence. So this is the absolute-based approach and a sector-based approach, which is an intensity approach, right? So the sector-based approach requires specific companies to reduce at different levels depending on the IEA carbon budgets for sectors. This graph is particularly good for showing that if you are in a sector which falls into the SDA and into the SDA options that we already have, and you've been doing, let's say, a really great job and you've made some great reductions in the last couple of years, you might not have to reduce as much as a company who is lagging behind in regards to sustainability. For example, let's say you were company C on the right-hand graph there. You do not have to make as aggressive of carbon reductions as company A, for example. And this is done on purpose in order to demonstrate that certain sectors have a tougher time to decarbonize, and therefore companies that have made good progress previously will not have to make the same level of aggressive reductions in the first couple of years. However, we all end up at the same end goal there, right? So the difference between this and the absolute contraction method is obviously all companies have to reduce at a linear rate with the absolute based approach, right? So this means it's an equal percentage reduction based on the IPCC carbon budget scenarios. I would say a good 90% of the companies that we receive set targets using our absolute based approach. And then there are a couple of companies that fall within the SDA methods that choose the sector based approach because that is just more suitable for the way that they would like to decarbonize. Right, so this is a really good, just a quick example of the differences again between absolute and sector-based approaches. So first with our absolute-based approach, this is our universal approach. It is sector agnostic. So scope 1 and 2 emissions have a contraction of absolute emissions in line with the decarbonization rate of climate scenarios. And so as of July 2022, that will be 1.5C only. So this method can be used by companies in every sector except for power generation and oil and gas. In particular, power generation companies have to use the power generation SDA, and we currently don't have guidance for oil and gas companies at this time. So a sector-based approach is sector-specific. It has a sector-specific physical indicator. So there's no option for you to choose how you would like to reduce your emissions. We have chosen for you. And that is the method that you will then use to model your intensity targets. So the SDA approach provides a sectoral decarbonization pathway that enables emission intensity targets. So this particularly covers heavy industries such as power, real estate, the ICT sector, some transport sectors, but some of these are still in the development and the refinement. However, the majority of them will be available by July 2022. And the SBTi is currently developing more bespoke sector approaches for some sectors, specifically like maritime shipping, forestry, land, and agriculture. And I know some of you might be following the flag developments, and that will be coming out soon, and will be slightly different. I think it will maybe have its own tool. However, all of the rest of those sectors, all of this can be found in our science-based target setting tool, which we will come on to a bit later. And so we've done all the calculations for you. All you have to do is just put in your company's information. Right, so this is, let me just put this here. So as we've chosen the absolute based approach in this slide, the graph on the left shows where companies make a submission. And then we look at the linear annual reduction rate, right? The LARR, right? And this is to make sure that the data is in line with the current science projections. So this means for different temperature targets, there are certain minimum requirements of reduction year on year. Again, I'd like to highlight that we're no longer accepting 2C targets, and as of July 2022, we will no longer be accepting well below 2C targets for scope 1 and 2. However, you can see the differences between the reduction rates here. So there are some companies that are still on this pathway because they have not had the chance to resubmit their targets yet, so that there will be a difference still on the website. However, for 1.5C companies, we would expect a minimum of 4.2% linear annual reduction rate, which corresponds to 21% reductions after 5 years, 42% reductions after 10 years, and finally 63% reduction after 15 years. So as explained before, we only allow organizations to set targets for a maximum of 10 years in the future. And many companies in the last year have been targeting 2030 because it looks good on paper, 2020 to 2030. But however, that gets us closer to 10 years. So with that change from 5 to 15, from 5 to 10, a lot of companies are still in line with our new recommendations. Can we go to the next slide? Right, so calculating the SDA is slightly more complex as companies need to input their data into the tool. The tool will look at data and compare it to a scenario input and confirm what reductions the company will need to make. So the tool will specifically look at what the output of the company is currently at and compare that with what the science says the output of the industry should be at in order to keep temperatures below, well below 2C. And in the future, we will be developing a lot of these pathways to be in line with 1.5C as well. And we'll come on to that in a little bit in more detail later to show you when those developments will be coming out. So it then allocates a company's share of those emissions, and then that informs the output of the tool. So it sounds a little bit more complicated than it is, but people that are much smarter than me have put it all together. And so I would really encourage you to play around with the SDA tool if you haven't had time to yet. Again, I'd like to highlight that this is only for very specific sectors. So if you aren't in one of those sectors that falls within the SDA, you should be able to use the absolute contraction to set our scope 1 and 2 targets. But then if you are in one of those sectors, I would encourage you to play around. Right, so how was the SDA built, right? So as stated before, we took sector level activities. So this can be projections from the different sectors in the ETP and sector activity metrics that are defined for each of those sectors, right? So for example, in cement, the sector activity level is cementitious material, right? Next, the sector CO2 emissions. So a direct CO2 emission trajectory for a given sector that is aligned with the temperature goal, right? So in our case here, we're looking at temperature goals that are either well below 2C and then also 1.5C once those pathways are updated. So finally, the sector intensity pathways is the result of dividing the total direct emissions of the sector in any given year by that total activity of the sector within that same year. Right, so the difference here is when we're talking about intensity convergence, right? Intensity convergence is based on the assumption that the carbon intensity of the company in that homogeneous sector will actually converge with the sector carbon intensity by 2050. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind, because when companies are trying to determine whether they want to use absolute contraction or the SDA tool, the key piece of information to keep in mind is the end goal will ultimately be the same. It's just the pathway on how you get there might be slightly different, right? So within each sector, companies can derive their science-based emission reduction targets based on their relative contribution to the total sector activity and their initial carbon intensity relative to the sector's intensity. So as it currently stands, this method does not cover certain activity sectors, such as the FLAG project, which is agriculture, forestry, land use, oil and gas, residential buildings, and some of the more, I would say, niche sectors that are not heavy emitters. So this is where we would encourage those types of companies at this moment to submit an absolute contraction target until those specific SDA methods are developed for you. Right, so this graph is fantastic, and I would really encourage everyone to, when the slides are sent around, this is the graphic you want to keep in mind, right? So these are all of the different options we currently have for companies to set scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 targets. So right now, if you wanted to set a 1.5C target for scope 1 and 2, that it means you have a 4.2% linear annual reduction rate for absolute based targets, or you have to have a 4.2% linear annual reduction rate using physical intensity to demonstrate your targets, but the actual reductions still need to be based on linear reductions, right? So, or you have to use the SDA tool. The SDA tools are currently only well below 2C aligned, except for the power generation sector. Power generation sector currently has a 1.5C pathway. All of the other SDA sectors will have 1.5C pathways that will become available this year. So right now, the only way we're able to temperature classify scope 1 and 2 targets as 1.5C aligned would be using the absolute contraction method. All other methods right now are well below 2C, but will be updated. However, when we get to scope 3, we have a lot more options, and there's a lot of different interplay you can have between these different target setting methods and your scope 3 emissions. So for example, you can set an absolute reduction target, you can set a physical intensity reduction target, you can set an economic intensity reduction target, and you can set a supplier engagement target. So for scope 3, right now, the minimum is 2.5% linear annual reduction rates in order to be in line with our version 5 criteria for scope 3 reductions. So this is a well below 2C pathway, and this is only because we realized that companies are still figuring out scope 3. There's a bit more flexibility we're going to give companies until we kind of had the same certainty that we have on a lot of the scope 1 and 2 emissions that we have right now for companies. So with the physical intensity reductions, there are kind of two different options here. One, you could model your scope 3 emissions based on the SDA, right? So the SDA will calculate everything for you, and it tells you the different reduction rates you'll need. Or you can set a physical intensity scope 3 reduction target, which is 2% physical intensity improvements and no increase in absolute emissions. Next, you could set an economic intensity reduction target, which is a 7% year-on-year annual reduction in economic terms. Finally, you can set a supplier engagement target, which have become very popular recently with companies. Some companies set, a combination of absolute targets and supplier engagement targets for scope 3. But the supplier engagement targets, the coverage needs to ensure that the boundary criteria is met within 5 years. So what we mean by this is for all other targets, you have to meet your target between 5 and 10 years. With supplier engagement targets, you have to fulfill that supplier engagement targets at a maximum of 5 years. And this is the only target setting method that is different from that 5 to 10 year target span. Right, so these are the different options we currently have available for SDA. So like I said before, power sector, power generators, they can only use the SDA. They cannot use the absolute contraction method. So the power generation has a 1.5C pathway, and again, you can find that in the SDA tool. Next, we have land and transportation sectors. So the land transportation sectors, such as auto manufacturers. And again, can be used the SDA or the absolute contraction. However, the thing I would like people to note here is auto manufacturers must set well below 2C aligned scope 3 targets on the use of sold products. So that is scope 3 category 11. And you can find more details and more information on our transport sector guidance on our website. The third piece here, which is very exciting, is financial institutions. So we've recently launched the financial institutions project, which has a completely different set of criteria. And I would really recommend, if you or a company that you work with is a financial institution and are looking to set science-based targets, I would really recommend you to look at that guidance and watch some of the webinars and the YouTube videos that they've put out, because it is a slightly different way to set targets. Next, we have aluminum, cement, commercial buildings, iron and steel, and pulp and paper. So these are our kind of more hard-hitting sectors, are hard to abate emissions, and they can use the SDA or absolute contraction. And I'll be giving a demonstration of one of these in a little bit. So next we have apparel and footwear and ICT. So again, these sectors don't have SDA pathways. So the absolute contraction method is the only method available for these sectors. And finally, all other sectors, like I said before, as long as you're not a power generation company or oil and gas company, you are more than welcome to use the absolute contraction method. And 90% of companies that submit targets to us use this method. All of this information, as well as more documents explaining the different resources for specific sectors, are available on our website under our resources tab. Right, and very exciting. So we have two methodologies that are coming up that I think are particularly of interest to people. So the first one is the FLAG project, the Forestry, Land and Agriculture project. And this is currently being finalized with the draft guidance. So the draft guidance for FLAG will become available in the next, I would say, month or two. And that will be put on our website before it is finalized. So if this is of particular interest to you, I would really recommend you keeping an eye on our website. So that way you can make sure when that draft guidance is released, you can take a look at it to see maybe what we'll be expecting in the final guidance. So that will be Q1 2022. The next piece here is maritime shipping. This method is currently available online within the maritime shipping sector, where it's the draft guidance and the draft target setting tool. Again, if this is of a particular interest to you, I would really recommend you going online and looking at the target setting tool and the guidance so you can see what we would be expecting from maritime shipping companies once that is finalized. We have a nice little question mark here next to Q2 2022 because this is kind of out of our hands. We're waiting for final confirmations on everything. However, the draft guidance is already available now and you can take a look at that today if you'd like. Right, so before we get into the target setting tool example, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Zaniko, who's just going to give you a bit of an overview of the different tools that we have available that companies have a lot of questions about.
Great, thanks so much, McKenna. So on this next slide, we have listed down some of the available tools that companies can make use of. And we also mentioned that we also do accept other tools that companies can use. But as long as if these tools are in line with the level of decarbonization that we have in our SBTi target setting tool. And also just to emphasize that these tools are available on our resources page, so feel free to have a look at our resources page and just toggle around the different buttons there, and you'll be able to access all of these tools. So starting off with the first one, this is our standard SBTi target setting tool. This version of the integrated target setting tool for companies includes the 1.5C aligned pathway for power sector companies to model their generation related GHG emissions. And this tool also applies the absolute contraction approach, which McKenna spoke about earlier, as well as the sectoral decarbonization approach, converging to 2050. And these, again, have updated temperature pathways. And there is also a sheet to calculate targets aligned with our Scope 3 criteria. Then secondly is the SBTi transportation tool. So this tool is a technical resource for companies to model their science-based targets for direct and indirect transport emissions. The tool is focused on the passenger, freight and OEM sector and provides GHG emissions accounting guidance and best practices for science-based target setting. And then thirdly, we have the net zero tool, which we recently launched. So this again is a target setting tool to calculate your long-term SBTs in line with the net zero standard. And also just to highlight that there will be an updated version of this available soon, which will consolidate the near-term or combine the near-term targets as well. And then on the fourth row, we have the GHG Protocol Scope 3 Evaluator tool. So this is a GHG Protocol developed tool, and it's commonly used by companies to perform their Scope 3 screenings, which is quite necessary, and it's a necessary step in preparing science-based targets for Scope 3 specifically. And then lastly, we have the SBTi Financial Institutions tool. And this tool allows, as the description says, it allows financial institutions to develop appropriate science-based targets in line with our financial institutions criteria. And again, just to emphasize that if you go and have a look at the resources page on our website, you will be able to find these tools. You can also go to the specific sector pages. So for example, with the financial institutions tool and the transport tool, you'll be able to find those on the specific sector page. And again, just to reiterate that we do accept other tools, but as long as if the outputs of that tool are in line with the level of decarbonization that we would require, or as per our SBTi target setting tool. And with that, I will hand it back over to McKenna to take us through the live demonstration.
Great, thanks, Zaniko. So let me just share my screen very quickly. So in order for everyone to kind of understand, this is our science-based target setting tool. You can find this target setting tool on our website. If you go to our website and click resources, and then you go to the tab that I think is called develop, and you scroll down, that there's a science-based target setting tool. Please note that there are two different options. There's a legacy option and a current option. I am using the current option. So if you are going to be setting targets with us in the future or want to kind of just model and see maybe what the different reductions are, please make sure that you are using this current model. We have a lot of problems with companies that use the legacy model, submit targets to us, and then we have to just have the conversation of, we have to use the newest and the most updated one there. So I'm going to be running through 3 quick demonstrations because I do want to leave some time for a Q&A. I saw that we have some really great questions already. So the 3 different scenarios I'm going to run here are, 1, a cement company who uses the SDA approach. I'm also then going to use that cement company for absolute contraction. So you can see the differences there. And then I think we're going to run a different scenario where we look at the different Scope 3 methods, because I know that a lot of you, Scope 3 is obviously where the majority of your emissions are, right? So let's start off with the absolute contraction approach for this cement company, right? So let's say our base year is 2019. I'm going to input 2019 there. Let me zoom in very carefully. So the reason I've used 2019 here is because in particular, we know that there was a lot of companies affected and impacted by COVID. So if your most recent year available for your company is 2020, but that data, let's say, is not representative of your business activities, you can use 2019, and this is perfectly acceptable as a base year. And then also keeping in mind that we realize some companies might be continually affected in 2021. And so you can find more information about how we're treating these kind of base year problems on our website within our FAQs. So I'm using a base year of 2019. I want to use a target year, let's say, of 2028. I'm going to be really ambitious. Go for it, right? So next, you have to input your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So for absolute contraction, we're not so the base year and the target year output are not so important here because no matter what it is, you have the same contraction approach year on year. So let's say my scope 1 emissions, for example, here are 225. 057 455. And then let's say our scope 2 emissions here, and keep in mind, right, we're doing a cement company. Let's say our scope 2 emissions here are going to be 10, 9, 6, 7. Great. So when we input this data, we scroll all the way down here to our absolute contraction approach, which is labeled under section 3. So as you can see, by the inputted data I have for our base year, it has given us our percentage reduction for both well below 2C and also 1.5C. So because I chose a target year that was under 10 years, my reduction is slightly under the slightly under what we would expect for 10 years, which would be closer to a 42% reduction. So I have a 37.8% reduction. And as you can see on our graphs, let me scroll this way, our scope 1 target is modeled and our scope 2 target is also modeled here, both for well below 2C and 1.5C. Scroll back this way. So these two reduction pathways, obviously right now we are still accepting well below 2C absolute contraction targets until July. But after July, you will no longer see this top section, right? It'll only be the 1.5C. So both of these two options here are what we expect from companies when they submit targets to us. So companies are more than happy to do these kind of calculations manually, right? An absolute contraction method of 4.2% year on year is easy to do, just adding things up and dividing by the target year. So that's absolutely fine. We don't necessarily need to see the tool as long as we understand that the calculations are the same. However, when we have companies that submit SDA targets, we do like to see the tool when we are validating targets in order just to keep consistency and understand properly exactly what the company's intentions are for reducing those emissions. And I'll come on to this in a little bit when we talk about the SDA ones. So these two reductions, this can be copied straight over to your submission form. This is all we would need to know from your company in order to proceed with an absolute contraction target. So nice and easy, right? So let's keep that same data. Let me just switch this. So let's say I'm still the cement company and I think, do you know what? I want to have a sector approach. I want to be in line with our sector and see if this changes what I need to reduce in the very near term. So I'm going to switch to a sectoral decarbonization approach. Right here, the SDA scenario, this is the ETP well below 2C target. Obviously, we will be updating these to 1.5C as soon as possible. So you should be able to have another option here to click 1.5C. But for the moment, for cement, we only have well below 2C. Next, we check our sector. So as discussed in the presentation, the sectors that currently have SDAs are power, iron and steel, cement, aluminum, pulp and paper, and services for buildings. This is not for domestic buildings. I want to be clear because we have some companies that are real estate companies that try to use the SDA, and there are just very certain requirements there. So please look at what we mean by services/buildings, right? So I'm going to come down here to cement. We're going to keep our base year and target year the same. However, the difference here when we set an SDA target is we have to choose what our projected output measure is going to be, as well as we have to input our base year output and target year output depending. So for example, I have the option of fixed market share or target year output. Target year output is for companies that know their growth rates and know how much they're going to grow within the sector, or who might know exactly what their output of the physical indicator would be in their target year. Fixed market share is for companies that maybe do not know what their growth rate will be by that target year, or don't have a good idea of exactly what they're going to grow within their sector. However, the fixed market share is for companies specifically who do not know this. If you know your growth rate, you need to be choosing the target year output measure. And we have some problems with this with companies that like to choose fixed market share, but then claim that they are going to grow massively and things like this. So you just need to be careful about which kind of projected output measure you're choosing here. So for my company, I'm going to choose fixed market share because let's say I don't really know what our output is going to be in 10 years time, right? So for my base year output, I'm going to assume some very high numbers here. Right. So I've chosen my base year output, which is in tons of cement or cementitious material. Now, keeping my scope 1 and 2 the same from our absolute contraction, you can see that our SDA graphs have been filled out here, which is great. And you can see here the sectoral activity growth over the target timeframe is 5.38%. So if we scroll down, we can see here the different reductions that are available for me to set for both scope 1 and for scope 2 targets. So this again is within the well below 2C scenario, right? So for all of these, you can see that there's a difference between the scope 1, the scope 2, and then also the combined scope 1 and 2. And this is particularly for companies that are wanting to set specific reduction targets for scope 1 only, for scope 2 only, or for companies that want their reduction targets to be demonstrated in a combined target, which is scope 1 and 2 together, right? And again, this information is what we will need to proceed with the validation process. However, for companies using the SDA, we would also really like for them to submit the target setting tool so we can make sure that the data that they've submitted in the submission form, as well as the data they've inputted in the target setting tool, is the same, right? So if we come up here, you can see our graphs, which is based on absolute emissions and then also the SDA intensity there. So ultimately, we are getting to the same level of reduction here as we did for the absolute contraction. However, the way that we're doing it is just going to be slightly different, right? So I know we are rapidly running out of time now, but I wanted to highlight some scope 3 methods as well. So let me zoom in here. So again, just to refresh everybody, scope 3 targets are required if scope 3 emissions are 40% or more of your greenhouse gas inventory, and you're required to cover your scope 3 emissions with a minimum 67% coverage boundary for scope 3. And I would like to just emphasize this for everybody. So the 67% is an absolute minimum. We would love for you to cover all of scope 3, and we would encourage companies to start making those steps because obviously with the new net zero guidance out, companies do have to cover 90% of scope 3 emissions to align with net zero. So if your company is interested in going on that pathway, I would encourage you to start off the bat, if you haven't set targets, to really try to cover as many of the scope 3 emissions as possible right away, so you're not up for a surprise a little bit later, right? So some of our scope 3 methods are available on our science-based target setting tool. You can click down here to the scope 3 tool option, and then you come up here to the target setting method. And now here we have, again, our absolute contraction method, our economic intensity method, and our physical intensity method. So one thing to keep in mind is the supplier engagement targets are not able to be modeled because they're not necessarily any quantitative data that we're requiring from companies at that time, other than an estimated number of suppliers that already have science-based targets. So we're not able to model these, obviously. So we've already done an absolute contraction approach. So I'm going to skip this one for now because it's absolutely the same calculation as we did previously. So let's focus on economic intensity, right? So for economic intensity, again, I'm going to select a base year. I'm going to select 2019 because my fictional company was impacted by COVID. I'm then going to click a target year, 2028 again. Next, the difference here is the base year output is in value added. So this is when we're looking for some sort of economic indicator, right? So let's put in here 10 million. I think that's 10 million. Yes, 10 million. And then we're going to click our scope 3 emissions. So you will need to put either your total scope 3 emissions here or the total of the specific categories you will be covering by a target. So like I said previously, you're able to cover different categories of scope 3 with different targets. However, you do need to ensure that the coverage is not overlapping here, right? So for example, if I wanted to cover my purchased goods and services with an economic intensity target, but the rest of my scope 3 with an absolute contraction target, I can do that. I just need to make sure I'm not overlapping, right? So in here, let's say I choose that I would only like to cover my scope 3 category 1 emissions with an economic intensity target. So out of all of my emissions, let's say scope 3 category 1 is, I don't know, 1,400,000 tons of CO2, right? And come down here, and economic intensity, it's given us, we need a 48% reduction for scope 3 category 1 if we want to align with the economic intensity requirements of 7% year-on-year economic improvements, right? And again, that's all we will need from you if you're choosing to do an economic intensity scope 3 target, as well as obviously the data that you've inputted. But again, this is why we encourage companies to submit the target setting tool to us during the validation process. So let's switch this up a little bit and we'll do a physical intensity. So the difference here between the physical intensity and also the SDA is physical intensity for scope 3 is not an SDA pathway. You are able to select the physical indicator unit that your company would be able to show progress against or track your emissions reductions. So the key thing to keep in mind here is we're looking for a physical intensity unit that best demonstrates your industry, right? So let's say I am a dairy producer and I produce milk products. A physical indicator for me might be tons of raw milk produced. Great. A physical indicator that doesn't make sense maybe is like, you know, I don't know, number of packages received. That doesn't make sense. Like, why would we receive packages if we're trying to output cow milk? Like, you know, so you need to pick something that makes sense for your industry. And in general, if you have chosen something that maybe doesn't make sense when we receive it as a submission, that's a conversation we'll have with you, and we'll just see if we can change it to make it make more sense. So that way, when it's displayed on our website, there is consistency in the tracking and the monitoring and the validation of that target, right? So let's go with the physical intensity target. We're keeping our base year and target year the same. So my base year output. So let's say here we are going to use, let's use tons of cow milk again. So let's say I have 10,000 tons of cow's milk in my base year. And let's say for my target year, I only want 11,000 tons of cow's milk. And let's say for those scope 3 emissions, we're going to say my total scope 3 emissions, right? Because I'm a dairy producer, so the tons of cow milk is appropriate for my whole scope 3 emissions, categories 1 to 15. So let's say my total emissions here are going to be quite big, 3.8 million tons of CO2. I scroll down here, and it gives me my physical intensity from my tons of CO2 against my custom physical unit that I've already input, right? And this is an 18% reduction that I would have to have in order to be in line with the physical intensity indicators. So the thing to keep in mind here again is right now the physical intensity for scope 3 is only aligned with under 2C. And this was because this is still under version 4.2 of our criteria. Obviously, this will be updated, so then all of your targets will be aligned with either well below 2C or 1.5C, but you can expect a significant increase in the expectations we would have for physical intensity, because physical intensity right now is one of the target setting methods that I would say still needs to be updated in order for us to be in line with the new requirements. So the 2% physical intensity improvements, that will be increased significantly in order to be in line with 1.5C. So if you are interested in setting a physical intensity target for scope 3, just keep that in mind that will be changing significantly, and the 2% physical intensity will be no longer accepted after July. So we've got 10 minutes left, and I think that's kind of in general, a good overview. And I think it'd be really interesting to see some of your guys' questions. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we have some of the questions from the chat. I'm just going to open this up. Zaniko, do I think we have some ready?
Yes, yeah,
Perfect.
We've got a couple of questions, and thanks so much to everyone who's been sending through questions. So perhaps the first question, McKenna, is can the same company adopt different target reduction approaches? Is that possible?
So this is possible for scope 3, definitely, and maybe slightly for scope 1 and 2, but just to clarify that. So we are looking for a consistent approach for scope 1 and 2. Let's say if you choose absolute contraction, great, you use absolute contraction for both. Or if you choose SDA, great, you use SDA for both, unless if you're setting an absolute contraction target, Scope 2 targets can be also achieved by a renewable energy target. And so you can find more information in our target validation protocol and our criteria as well. But if you set a renewable electricity procurement target that is, I think, 85% by 2025, or 2028, I'll need to double check, and then 100% achievement by 2030, we would also recognize that as an appropriate scope 2 target in conjunction then with an absolute contraction target for scope 1. So that's a way to do it. However, for example, if you were setting an SDA target for scope 1 and 2, but then you don't want to set an SDA target for scope 3, that's absolutely fine. We just need a bit of consistency with the scope 1 and 2. And then you can kind of choose different options for scope 3. We have a lot of companies that choose a variety of scope 3 targets in order for them to meet and kind of explore the different options for their company specifically. So that could be a mix of SDA for certain categories, absolute contraction for other scope 3 categories. You could throw a supplier engagement target in there for some fun. Like, there's different options you can play with, but the scope 1 and 2 is what we want a consistency with for sure.
Thanks, McKenna. Perhaps another question closely tied to the one you've just answered now. The question is asking for scope 1 and 2 emissions, can companies use both absolute contraction and physical intensity? Because the question was saying that they currently thought that it was only absolute reductions that are applicable.
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and it's a piece that I think a lot of companies get confused about. So the two options for the actual methods to set your targets right now are absolute contraction or SDA for scope 1 and 2. The difference here is we have some companies that choose to express their absolute targets in intensity form. So the way that they do this is they have an actual absolute contraction target at its core, right? They are making that 4.2% 4.2% linear annual reduction year on year. But the way that they're expressing their target is by an intensity reduction. So what you see on the website might say, you know, company X plans to reduce their emissions. Again, we'll use the cow example. Well, company X chooses to reduce their emissions X% per ton of cow's milk from 2019 to 2028, right? However, that is expressed in an intensity, but it's actually modeled against an absolute contraction target. So then from the previous 4.2 criteria that we had, that's actually an option you can choose. And some companies choose to demonstrate that kind of emissions reductions to their stakeholders in their internal employees. It just makes more sense for maybe their sustainability strategy, and that's fine. But the actual target is still absolute contraction.
Perfect. Thanks so much, McKenna. The next question is just around the difference between the SDA guidance or methods and sector guidances, and on what's the difference between the two, and what is their preference for either for companies?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really good question as well, because I think it's slightly confusing, and we're working on making it much more clear on our website. So for certain sectors, if you go on our website under sector guidance, we already have guidance available for certain sectors, right? However, some of these sectors, even though they have guidance, don't have an SDA or vice versa. right? So there are certain SDA pathways that we have now because we have the actual science, we have the data, so we've created the SDA pathway. For example, cement. We have a cement pathway because we know the IEA data allows us to do that for a well below 2C pathway. However, very excitingly, we are still in the process of developing our cement guidance. So if you're a cement company, I know that a lot of cement companies use the CSI methodology and guidance to kind of calculate their targets currently. And that's great, you know, align with your industry and best practice. However, make sure that you are also in line with our general criteria. For example, specifically for cement, a lot of companies report on net emissions, but in general for the SBTi, we make all companies report gross emissions. So even though you're following external guidance, you do need to still follow the general guidance we have for SBTi. So again, the key difference here is there are some sectors that have sector guidance from us, but maybe do not have an SDA. Then there are other sectors that have an SDA, but do not have guidance. If there is guidance available on our website, we would be expecting companies to follow that guidance when submitting targets. However, if you have an SDA pathway available but no guidance, you don't necessarily need to set an SDA with us unless for some reason the guidance becomes available in the next couple of months. So it's just this kind of strange interplay between some methods we have available because the science allows us to, but the sector guidance is actually still in development.
Great, thanks, McKenna. The other question is just perhaps on whether we have an indication of whether we'll have SDAs being made available for professional services, food. Yeah, do we have this in the pipeline?
Yeah, so I think in general, the rule here is check our website. So there's a nice list of sectors that either have SDAs in development or sector guidance that are in development. And this is a really good way to stay on top of things. I did see there were some questions about some sectors that actually have had guidances released already. So do make sure that you are keeping tabs on us on our website and the different pages that are updated because, for example, like the aviation guidance is out, aviation tool is out, find it on our website. And the same thing with some of the draft guidances for like maritime shipping. And you can expect the draft guidance and to be out for the flag project. However, for some of the sectors that you just named there, professional services, I would say don't ever expect that from us. I think only because the SDA specifically, I would say we're trying to target more hard to abate sectors. And for us, professional services definitely is not a hard to abate sector. However, you can use some of the SDAs if your activities fall within the SDA pathways we have available for scope 3, for example, or you can choose to use a physical indicator. So for example, for some professional service firms, they choose to set a physical target for scope 3 over like per full-time employee, because that demonstrates your sector, like a physical indicator for your sector. And that's one way to do it. And I would say the same thing for food sectors. Obviously for food, wait for the flag guidance to come out because the flag guidance will have more specific, I would say, recommendations for us from us about different ways that you can help reduce certain aspects of your value chain, specifically the agriculture part of that. So that is something to keep in mind. Again, I'd like to encourage you to take a look at the draft flag guidance when that comes out in the next couple of months, because as a whole, the draft guidance will be a very good indication of what we'll be expecting from targets later on.
Perfect. Thanks, McKenna. The next question is on, I see we are running out of time, is on scope 3 and whether, you know, a company should set their scope 3 target based on their industry or their customers or suppliers industry. So what should they be looking at?
Right. So I think in general, we're wanting companies to set scope 3 targets based on the industry that you're in and the emissions that you actually have within your value chain for sure. However, I can understand that there are some industries where maybe setting like a customer engagement target for scope 3 might make more sense. And so I know we've referenced in the presentation previously that we were talking about supplier engagement targets. However, that target technically is supplier/customer engagement. And there are some companies that choose to set a customer engagement target for scope 3 because that more accurately reflects their emissions within their scope 3.
Maybe second to last question before we wrap up. There's a question on the tool and whether companies can set or can decide to set more ambitious targets for scope 1 and 2.
And the answer is yes, and thank you. So in general, all of the things I've talked about in the presentation today are the minimums. And I think companies forget this sometimes because we see some companies coming in with like 4.198% linear annual reductions. And you're like, the minimum is 4.2. Like we would love for you to set a 4.5 or a 5% target. Great. And the same thing for SDA. The output of the SDA tool is the minimum. So if you look at that and think, oh, easy, great, set a more ambitious target. We would love for you to do that. And the target validation team would have a little party when we saw your submission form.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, McKenna. I will now hand it back over to Amelie just for wrapping up.
Thank you so much, Janiko and McKenna. And we hope you had a good session with us. So to wrap up, I want to urge everyone to go to our resources page on the SBTi website, toggle around the different tabs, and you get to see all of the guidance, materials, and tools. And today's recording, as well as slides, together with last week's recording and slides, will be updated on the SBTi YouTube channel. So thank you so much once again, and we'll see you soon.